All right. Good evening, all. We have instituted a new process where we turn the camera on after we've gone live rather than stare awkwardly at you while we're trying to figure out whether we have. I hope you all appreciate the improvement. I am Kevin Williamson, the guy you get when Jonah Goldberg is not available. We have Price St. Clair with us tonight. We're going to talk a little Trump indictment, but starting specifically with the issue of the judge in the case. Judge, I believe it's pronounced Aileen, although it makes like it might be Eileen, but I've heard it pronounced Aileen Cannon. And Price is here to tell us a little bit about that. So Price, who is she? What's her background and how did she get assigned to the case?
Great questions, Kevin. And I am a little embarrassed to say that I spent all day, sort of yesterday and today, trying to figure out what's the deal with Judge Cannon, write an explainer, and I did not answer the question of how to pronounce her first name. So, but long story short is she's a federal judge in Florida, in the District Court of the Southern District of Florida, appointed by Trump, but we would not have ever heard of her probably unless she had been assigned to both of these two cases that involve Trump and the classified documents. The first one being a civil suit that Trump actually filed against the government in the fall after the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago. And the second one being this, criminal proceeding that's happening right now. And this is sort of notable for two reasons. And one reason I wanted to write an explainer about it is sort of as soon as she was announced, like, oh, this is going to be the judge that's going to preside over the criminal case.
The world went nuts.
Yeah, it's like, oh, she needs to recuse herself. But I thought to myself, like, I remember last summer when Steve Bannon was on trial in the DC District Court for contempt of Congress, and no one was really making a big deal about the fact that he was being tried by a Trump-appointed judge. So, and I, was a little rusty on what happened with the special master and all this stuff at Mar-a-Lago in the fall. So anyway, people are upset about the way that she was making rulings in the Trump special master case, that she was being exceptionally friendly to Trump. That's led some people to say she ought to recuse herself. But you said you were a
little rusty about that case. I think everyone might be. Yes. Why don't we go into some detail about what that case was, where it came from, and which of her rulings were controversial and why?
Sure. So if you remember, on August 8th of 2022, the FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. There's some controversy.
I think I saw something about that on the news.
Yes, among whether that was a raid, whether it was just or not. Trump thinks this was a really bad thing. But anyway, they came and took classified documents that he had not given back to the government yet. And that was part of an ongoing federal investigation into Trump's handling of the documents, which now we have criminal charges in, but at the time was just the government is investigating this. And so then Trump sued because this happened at Mar-a-Lago, he sued in the Southern District of Florida. And there's sort of a random, I don't know if it's a random number generator or what, but the judges in the Southern District of Florida get randomly assigned cases like these. And so Aileen Cannon got that case. And in particular, what Trump was asking for that she then granted and appointed was this special master. And I think most other Americans had not heard of a special master until last September, whenever this was occurring. And the idea with the special master is this is a sort of outside expert that's not part of the court that's going to come in and cull through all the documents that the FBI had seized and sort of decide, are some of these covered by executive privilege or some of these covered by attorney-client privilege? What can the FBI sort of use or not use? What can they view or not view as part of their investigation? And so Judge Cannon granted that, but then, I don't want to get too much into the legal weeds, but there were also instances in which the special master was like, okay, well, I've done some review, but now I want the Trump legal team to sort of go back through and verify that the FBI's inventory is correct. And then she sort of turned down what the special master that she had appointed had said. So people were pointing to things like that as evidence of,
So my understanding is she overruled him in favor of a procedure that the Trump legal team favored.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I got wound up about this. She was widely criticized about this sort of from across the legal spectrum. And then eventually the 11th Circuit, a 3-judge panel, all of whom were conservative judges appointed by Republican presidents, was a sort of scathing reversal of her decision, basically saying you've set up this separation of powers problem that either we have to create a special carve out for presidents, or we have to have a situation where anyone who has been subject to a search warrant can now come to the judicial branch and say, after this search warrant has occurred, you can now block and change how the government uses what it is lawfully seized, as long as, so you can talk about whether warrants are lawful or not, but sort of ex post facto changing the rules for the warrant. Or we do nothing and sort of say this was lawful. And the 11th Circuit said, we're going to do nothing and say this was lawful. And you, Judge Cannon, can reverse, we're telling you to reverse this, which she did. So the question then becomes, what do you do with that information? And some liberal legal commentators have said, well, she should recuse herself. I was talking to a former senior Justice Department official today, not named Sarah Isgur, and this person was telling me, obviously can criticize how judges rule, but a judge shouldn't be judged on decisions they made, rulings they made in one particular case. And it is very rare for judges to recuse themselves from things.
Sure. Anyway. So my understanding of this, though, is that the tone and the speed and the unanimity and the definiteness of the overruling gave it the character of a rebuke, rather than just being a matter of saying, well, we think the judge got it wrong on this issue. It was more of a matter of, we think the judge really, really screwed up this issue and is off the reservation in a sense. Am I mischaracterizing that, or is that your reading of it as well?
Oh, I think you may totally be right. This is where, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't.
Me either.
But yes, I think you're right in the general sense of the 11th Circuit response did feel like a rebuke. And you're not, again, there's a lot of sort of conservative, Federalist Society people who would look at what Cannon had decided in this case and were like, oh, I'm not sure that makes sense. I talked to a guy yesterday, Paul Cassell, who's a professor at University of Utah and used to be a federal judge. And he was sort of saying, well, the 11th Circuit struck it down on jurisdictional grounds, which was fine, but maybe on the merits, it made more sense, which to me is the kind of lawyerly distinction that I just okay, well, it's in the past and they said jurisdictionally doesn't make sense. So why are
That's why nobody likes lawyers.
Exactly. Anyway, so yeah. So
there is certainly among her critics and among Trump's critics, and let's say among probably Democrats, generally a sense that she has given enough of an impression of bias that they are suspect of her impartiality in the case. That she didn't just make a wrong legal decision, but was showing extraordinary solicitousness for Trump's political well-being and for his personal reputation and that sort of thing. So what are the relevant rules here for recusal?
So a couple things. Number one, I since I wasn't, I don't think I made this explicit earlier, and people can read about this in the explainer that I think will be coming out tomorrow. So it turns out in both the civil case and the criminal case, it was random both times. Sometimes in federal courts, the judges that are on sometimes oh, this case is related to the previous one that you were working on, so we're going to put them together. But because the civil case was open and shut and no longer in operation, the court did not decide these are relevant things. She had the documents before, now we're going to give her the documents case again. It was just sort of roll of the dice both times.
So my understanding is they have something they call the wheel, and
yes, at least in
the sequence.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how all the districts do it, but a source I was talking to said in at least some districts they literally have a wheel that they spin, and that's what decides it. Now, in this case, there's a lot of judges in the Southern District of Florida, but really only 6 or 7 that could were in a geographical division that it would make sense for them to take it. So I think of it almost more like rolling a dice. Or a die, I should say. To your question,
some people know the singular, some people don't.
Yes. To your question about what are the relevant rules for recusal, I'm not 100% sure, but the clerk of court for the district court told the New York Times that unless she recuses herself, which I gather is unlikely she will voluntarily do, then she'll be on this case through to the end. And the question,
so there isn't anyone who can force her off.
I can't say with 100% certainty.
Okay.
It's possible that the government could come in and say, and by the government I mean like the DOJ in this criminal proceeding, they could make a motion and say, oh, she needs to recuse herself for XYZ reason. And they would make some argument about her partiality towards Trump, but then that would be, I'm not exactly sure who would have the authority to enforce that in the legal system. So I apologize for not being able to provide a complete answer.
Well, that's okay. You've got some more reporting to do. That's fine. We'll get it in the next piece. These are the questions that come up for me. So the questions, of course, that really come up are, if you've got a friendly judge versus a hostile judge, it's not about just having the cash thrown out or something, although the sort of people who talk about minting platinum coins are talking about something called Rule 29 right now, which maybe we'll get to in a little bit. But it's really a question of, how she's going to rule on various motions and trial issues as they come up. And one of the things that is, currently being much discussed is that there's an assumption that the prosecution would like to have a fast trial, and that the Trump team would not, that they want to drag this out as long as they can for all sorts of reasons. One is that it's probably politically good for Trump. It helps with his fundraising. It kind of makes him the center of the story and makes it harder for other candidates to get some kind of traction. I'm trying to avoid the cliche about sucking up all the oxygen in the room, but you know what I mean. And so that is the sort of thing I assume that judicial discretion would really weigh very heavily in. Do we have any sense of how big a factor the judge is likely to be in whether the trial happens quickly or not?
The judge will play a significant role in that. And I'm not sure I can, speak with specificity much beyond that. But in talking with sources yesterday and today, it's just a worthy refresher of every time I cover legal issues. I just sort of have this simplistic, sophomore civics model in my head of everyone comes to a courtroom and they, talk it out for a few days and then you get the answer. This stuff is complicated, particularly when it's a former president, particularly when there are classified documents involved. So this former Justice Department official I spoke with earlier talked about sort of 4 buckets in which the judge, her discretion will influence the arc and timeline of the case. And the main one, this would just be true for any judge in any trial, is evidentiary questions. Mm-hmm. What evidence is admissible and not admissible? And in particular I think it's the Classified Information Procedure Act, or CIPA, that actually has less to do with the government and more with the defense, in terms of the government is sitting on all these classified documents that they have, retrieved from Mar-a-Lago. And the question is, how much classified information that was referred to in the indictment, or that's sort of outside the pages of the indictment itself, but related to the case, how much of that stuff does the defense need to be able to put its eyes on to be able to construct a fair defense?
Mhm.
I have no idea how those questions are going to be answered, but the judge's rulings are going to make an effect on that. And to your point, just a few minutes ago, I mean, this is a timeline thing. And I was reading an article earlier, some judges are good managers of time and some aren't. And, I'm sure their sort of individual dispositions and partiality or lack thereof, plays a role. So that's one, is sort of this evidentiary questions in SEPA. And then other things, and Sarah mentioned this in her newsletter today, instructions to the jury. That'll make a difference in terms of you're telling the jury, this is what the law that I'm asking you to make a verdict on says. And then there's the Rule 29 stuff. And then eventually, if the jury returns a conviction, the judge ultimately decides about sentencing too. So those are sort of the 4 buckets.
Sure. Should we talk about Rule 29?
We should talk about Rule 29.
Let's talk about Rule 29. What is it?
It is a rule in the Federal Criminal Procedure Rulebook, which I gather, and please tell me if I'm wrong, I think either Congress or the Justice Department first put together in the 40s, and it's been edited since then, but trying to, provide regular operating procedure for federal criminal trials. And it's this thing where, so one of my sources I was talking to earlier was saying Rule 29 basically is this thing where the defense can ask the judge to sort of look at the evidence that was presented, particularly by the government, by the prosecutors, and say this is basically inadmissible and so bad that we're not even going to give it to the jury. And there are two ways this can work. So the government will finish presenting its argument, and then 100% of the time, the defense attorney is going to get up and make a motion to dismiss or a motion to acquit on Rule 29. And almost never is a judge going to agree to that, because if it happens before the jury deliberates, then that basically ends the trial. The defendant is acquitted, and it's not appealable. So this would be you can project in the future. If this ever were to happen in the Trump trial, would be nuts, because now we've reached the end of the road. There's no appeal. Now,
and this is why it's being talked about so much on MSNBC, because it's an unlikely scenario, but one that would be very dramatic and
yes,
settle the case in a dispositive way that they don't want. So it's a good way to get people riled up, but not something that's likely actually to come into play.
It's not likely to come into play. So rare but significant is what I would say. And I just want to emphasize that
now that we've said that, it's absolutely going to happen, right?
Yeah, of course. If it were to happen, but that, it stops the sort of the clock. If that happens before the jury deliberates, it's possible, also unlikely, but possible that the judge would wait until after the jury renders a verdict and says that the defendant, that Trump, is guilty. Then if Rule 29 is invoked at that point, after the jury is ruled, then it can be appealed. And sometimes a judge will decide to do that on purpose because they want the appellate court to review it. If this was a particularly difficult, again, in the abstract, separating from Trump, if this is a really difficult case, you want it to go forward and more deliberation to occur, then you would let it go up to appeals. But you're right. This is a unlikely scenario.
Yeah. So you're very young. You're not old enough to remember like the O.J. Simpson trial. You probably weren't even born, actually. But
I was not. I watched the 10-hour ESPN documentary on it 8 years ago, whenever that came out, but it's been a while.
So, for a while there, Lance Ito, who was the presiding judge in that case, was like one of the 4 or 5 most famous men in America, probably. I think it's sort of endlessly parodied in various kinds of ways. Are we expecting Judge Cannon to be as large a figure in the coming days? Do you think that people are really going to try to make an issue of her and her alleged bias in favor of Trump and his defense?
In the spirit of Dispatch Live rank punditry, I'd say probably yes. Yeah, I would not at all be surprised if in the next few days we get, well, actually I say that, I don't know the next time Trump's due in the courtroom. So whenever that happens and we sort of get more experience sort of learning how she's dealing with the courtroom, then she may be parodied on the late night shows and whatnot. I was thinking about this earlier. It is interesting that, she's well known for sort of this widely denounced sort of set of rulings in the civil case for good reason, perhaps. But again, this was like a spin of the wheel 2 times that she, got the unlucky number. And so now she is going to be a world famous, probably world historical note somewhere in the records. And otherwise in other circumstances, she could have been a totally forgettable federal judge that,
Yeah, clarify one thing here. So when I was reading about the wheel, I got the idea it was a term of art, and it meant that you were up basically, and you caught a case as it came in. Are you telling me they actually spend something? Because if so, the fact that Pat Sajak has just announced his retirement, I think makes this a nice bit of irony.
My impression is, well, I think there is such a thing as like there's this, some rotating calendar or something for certain things, but I mean, if this is wrong, then I'm going to look stupid, but it's fine. I'm here with the Dispatch Live audience that'll maybe be more forgiving. When I was talking to my source earlier, he was saying in the Southern District of New York, they actually had, like, it's just a big enough district with so many judges that I think they literally had a wheel that would allow people cases. So
that's right.
Anyway.
Well, you shouldn't feel bad about knowing some stuff. It's admitting that you don't know something is often the right answer. Most of us don't know many things about many things. That's why we have journalism and such. Amen. All right, well, appreciate your time. I think we'll bring in Mike here. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that we should talk about before I close it out? No, but I'm glad you asked that question. I try to ask that to my sources regularly. It's good. Yeah, that's. I'll let you and Mike get. That's the standard. Tell us more about the arraignment. All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Here I am.
Hey, Mike, what's going on?
How are you, Kevin?
Here in North Texas, we have hail the size of cantaloupe falling out of the sky and tearing things up all over the place. So it's a little weird out there. And
everything's bigger in Texas.
Everything is bigger in Texas. In Dallas, for whatever reason, the infrastructure is set up in such a way that a 1/4 inch of rain basically will shut the city down. All the traffic lights stop working. So actual like kind of bad weather where your phone is going off at 4 o'clock in the morning and there's sirens and things is different. I heard sirens last night, by the way, and I thought, man, there's just a lot of arrests in the neighborhood tonight. But it's that kind of neighborhood. Sometimes the sirens are tornadoes. Sometimes the sirens are other things. So something happened in Miami today. What was going on?
Just your standard beginning of summer. People are out on the beach, going to get a Cuban sandwich and dominoes. Yeah, exactly. The former president was arraigned and arrested the first time for a federal case that a former president has been arrested. And so it happened. There were no cameras in the courtroom. There were some those courtroom drawings, that came out and some reporters who were in the room, but it happened. You were talking earlier with Price about OJ. There was I had a surreal experience. Like I was rewatching the famous white Ford Bronco chase because the helicopter camera was watching and following the motorcade as Trump was making his way to the courthouse. So what's passed is
real quick issue. I love the courtroom drawings and stuff, and keeping the cameras out of there is probably the right thing. But people keep asking me this, so I'll ask you: 2 arrests, why no mugshots?
So I saw the reporting today that essentially the court determined that he is well known enough to have, and I think we can agree with that, that a mugshot was unnecessary. I would love to read a sort of history of the mugshot because I don't quite understand the purpose other than to give the court and to give law enforcement, a physical, a photographic record of who they have booked. Interestingly, his Trump's alleged co-conspirator, Walt Nauta, who's essentially his aide, former military aide when he was
Valet, as
president.
I understand it.
A valet, yes. Is what was booked, and they did take a mugshot of him. So, but no mugshot for Trump, no perp walk or anything like that. But it happened. The Chiron on CNN and the others was Trump arrested, and you could sort of feel the viewers of CNN and MSNBC sort of jumping with joy at finally seeing those words.
Yeah, I was wondering what all that noise was about, but I guess that was it. It's good to have the mugshot though, because if you have to do one of those Old West wanted posters one of these days, that would be really helpful. So we'll leave most of the legal analysis to the lawyers.
Thank you.
who podcast for us and stuff. Maybe we'll talk about some politics. So arrest number 2, indictment number 2, 37 counts, felonies. Is it getting to be old hat for people? They're like, Trump's been charged again. He's going to get charged at least probably 2 more times. Who knows? It's just part of the. It's just another act in the circus. Is it significant? How are Republicans responding to this? The elected ones in particular. What do you think?
Where to start? I mean, the question of this political significance, which is I think what you're getting at, Kevin, is remains to be seen. But the sort of legal facts and the legal reality that Trump is about to face, that you sort of began to go over with Price just a few minutes ago. I mean, that is something that cannot be PR'd away. That's something that Trump likes to do when he's in legal trouble, start the PR offensive, which he's already done, which he will continue to do. But he's got some hurdles when it comes to even that PR campaign. I mean, yes, he is a candidate for president, but if he's going to trial, which we don't know when the trial is going to be set, we don't know if Trump will want a speedy trial, which is his right to request, or will he want it later? Will he want to delay it until maybe after the election?
Seems to be almost universal assumption that he's going to want to drag it out. Do you think that's
right?
Unwarranted competence?
Perhaps an idea that it's better for him, better for his campaign to be the martyr before he actually has to face a jury. And that ultimately is what is different. It's certainly what's different about this case versus the Allen Bragg case in New York, which seems to me, even from my layman's non-lawyer perspective, a pretty weak case. I've seen lots of people people who I trust, who I talk to, make that case. This is different. Obviously the talking indictment from the DOJ is their best case that they've put forward. But it does not take a law degree to judge the existence of the evidence that the government claims, and we have every reason to believe they have, the existence of what Trump has said, what he said at the time, that he could have declassified this information that he's waving around, that he chose not to, that he was documentation of aides and attorneys who were talking about moving boxes around, evidence that he was withholding this from federal investigators, that he was trying to hide and conceal it. I mean, it does it wash over people? Perhaps if you are willing to believe that any sort of attempt at consequences for Donald Trump must be suspect, must be immediately considered partisan. But if you're not, and that is not every Republican primary voter, and it's certainly not every general election voter, even Democratic leaners, or even independents and Republican leaders, this has the potential politically to cause some real problems for Trump. What is he going to be able to say? Or what will he say on the campaign trail? As he, talking about this, he's a public figure. He's a candidate for president. That could severely hurt his case, his active case in front of the judge. And then, of course, we have some of these other cases. The Georgia DA seems to be another one that's a question, right, of whether or not this will also sort of have the goods in the way the Alvin Bragg, Stormy Daniels extortion case doesn't seem to have. And of course, that answer to that question will maybe even color how people view all of these together. But when you have people like Bill Barr, the former AG appointed by Donald Trump, who had a very well documented view that of a unitary executive, very strong executive can do a lot of things. When he says that essentially they have him dead to rights, you have a problem. The question I have, and maybe we can get into a little more, is what are elected Republicans saying and going to do, and particularly in Congress, and what are the rivals that are running against Trump saying and doing?
Well, you provided your own question, so you may as well answer it.
Okay, well, there you
Let's
go.
go.
Well, I've been working with our colleague Audrey Fallberg on a story that she's been reporting about what members of Congress are saying. She spoke to a number of senators last night on Capitol Hill about this. And, what we kind of together, as I was editing this piece, we kind of emerged, there seems to be let's say three categories of elected Republicans. The first are the hardcore Trump loyalists. That's a big chunk of the House Republican Conference, and it's a not insignificant number of senators. The Senate is supposed to be, the deliberative body, the place where the sort of elder statesmen are. But of course, that's not always the case.
People like Josh Hawley,
days. Josh Hawley, or for instance, J.D. Vance. Look, J.D. Vance is somebody who owes his political career to Donald Trump. And J.D. Vance is saying things. I mean, he told Audrey, essentially incredulously, are we really going to trying to throw the president of the United States in jail because he didn't cross enough T's on the way out? That's how the sort of hardcore Trump loyalists are putting this. This is no big deal. By the way, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and whoever else has done the same thing, and nobody prosecuted them.
I assume they're all fundraising very effectively off this, like everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that is happening. It's sort of we're at the end of the fundraising cycle, but a lot of these people are fundraising, are trying to get attention. I mentioned J.D. Vance. He's announced he's holding up every DOJ appointee, that has to come before the Senate for advising consent from the Biden administration, except for U.S. Marshals. He mentioned that's an exception. Holding up all of those appointees in the ways and the procedural ways that senators can do so in protest of this indictment.
So unless Tommy Lee Jones played you in the movie, no,
I know,
confirmation.
Exactly.
That sounds responsible and intelligent.
They're not going to let the one-armed man get away with it, or Dr. Kimball. So that's one group, and that's a big part of the House conference, smaller part, but significant part of the Senate conference. And I think the polls show reflective of sort of where Republican primary voters are. But that's not every Republican elected official. And that's where I think things get interesting. So then you have members, most of them in the Senate, although there's a few in the House, people like Don Bacon from a Biden district, but a Republican in Nebraska, who are expressing concern. These are very serious allegations. By the way, I should say that even some of the pro-Trump folks say they're serious allegations. So that's an interesting, significant through line in all of this. They just think it's serious because of how dangerous it is for Trump that all these partisans are attacking him and going after him. But this sort of the second group here, these are Republicans who are kind of keeping their powder dry. They say, he deserves his day in court. I'll withhold judgment. It's kind of a very prudent position for them to take, and suggests, to me at least, that they're waiting to see kind of how this all shakes out. We had so many Republicans come out immediately on the news announced by Donald Trump last week that he was going to be indicted. kind of get out in front and say, this is an outrage. The FBI, the DOJ, they're out of control. And then the indictment came out and everyone kind of went, I'm not so sure I should have gotten that out. Yeah.
Am I the only one who's lost mic?
Lost me. Uh-oh.
All right, you're back. Never mind. Just a little.
Oh, good. Whew. You know, it says my internet connection is unstable. So I don't know. Maybe the MAGA deep staters are trying to get me here.
You have very stable genius.
And then,
well, we might have lost a few seconds there. Do you want to?
Well, I was just sort of summing up where this middle group of Republicans are. They are, they're keeping their powder dry, waiting to see what happens, and suggests that they think that maybe public opinion could move. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say they are sort of being prudent for prudence sake. They are political animals after all. And Kevin, I know how you feel about politicians.
Love them.
I know you do.
So category 1 is the maniacs. Category 2 is the cowards or the timid. And I assume category 3 is Chris Christie.
Chris Christie, Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski. Yes, they're the sort of moderate who you expect. But there's a sort of clearing of the BS and all of this, the sort of all the throat clearing from that second group. Well, we have to take these things seriously. That Trump will have to keep his day in court. This third group is sort of cutting through all of that and saying, this is ridiculous. This is sort of outrageous that Trump is putting the country through this. This is essentially what Mitt Romney himself said. I'm pulling up here on my computer the exact thing that he said. Yes, Trump is entitled to the presumption of innocence, Romney said in a statement, but he brought these charges upon himself by not only taking classified documents, but by refusing to simply return them when given numerous opportunities to do so. It reminds me, Kevin, of when of the sort of, I don't know who first said this joke, but it was something like, if you ask, uneducated moron what the Civil War was about, they'd say it was about slavery. And if you ask somebody who's kind of read on things, but maybe they fancy themselves as sort of self-educated historian on things, maybe they might say, well, the Civil War was about a lot of complicated different aspects. There were sort of states' rights issues, and there was trade concerns, and there were all these sort of things. And so you can't really say for sure exactly was there one cause. And then you talk to like PhDs in American history, experts on the Civil War, and they'll say, yeah, the Civil War was about slavery. I mean, once you get down to it, the simplest answer or the simplest explanation or the simplest sort of argument is what seems to be winning with this third group. And, there's a lot of clarity in that. And that's what you're hearing from, yes, Romney, but also Chris Christie and, maybe less consequential Asa Hutchinson.
Yeah. So I suppose that raises for me the question of how this conversation is really going to go. So there's the legal issue, which is, can the government come in and prove these charges in such a way that it gets a guilty verdict out of jury? And that's going to be David French and Sarah Isgur talking about that, not us for the most part. And these are, legal questions that'll be subject to legal analysis. But setting aside the outside and unlikely possibility that there was evidence planted that the audio tapes have been faked, as some people are already suggesting, you can fake audio evidence, assuming that the government hasn't just made up all the stuff that's in the indictment, that these actually refer to real things that can be documented, assuming that the photos haven't been doctored and all that. The facts of the case, as we know right now, are pretty damning, obviously. Well, not obviously, pretty damning from my point of view, and I think from a lot of people's point of view. And that is a separate conversation, I think, from the conversation about whether the prosecution can prove these charges to the satisfaction of the court and the jury. Do you see that as a political issue starting to diverge already, or are we going to end up just being so focused on the jury verdict that we lose sight of the broader picture, which is the documented irresponsibility of the way in which he handled the documents and the dishonesty with which he responded to the attempts to get them back.
Well, sort of prudentially, or sort of, sorry, I should say, sort of the prosaic question is that answer to that question is it matters when the trial happens, right? It matters if this is delayed or if this happens quickly.
You got a feeling for that?
I don't. I'm not clear on that. It's like you said that there's all the incentive in the world for Donald Trump to drag this out. That makes sense to me. So it would.
Sometimes he does things you're not expecting, though.
Exactly. That's the only thing you can expect from Donald Trump, is that he will surprise you. But the political question, again, it is going to be up to the people who are running against him for president. And that means at the moment, the Republicans who are running against him for the nomination. And if he wins the nomination, Joe Biden, or I guess if some other Democrat somehow wins the nomination, well, let's assume Joe Biden. This is a political argument in the end. And you get this sense from people like Chris Christie, who says it out loud. If you want to beat the guy, you've got to go at him directly. That's what he's trying to do. And that is very compelling to me. It makes a lot of sense to me as a sort of path to beating Trump. You can't beat Trump unless you beat him. But I've been sort of noodling over why the pussyfooting around really is the best way to describe how people like Ron DeSantis and Mike Pence, and you're starting to see a little bit of cracks in there from those people, from Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, saying, these are very serious allegations. Again, they're in that middle group, trying to see where things are. But I've been thinking about why is this so difficult? You're running for president because in a field that includes Donald Trump, the former president, and sort of the party's leader, you are implicitly saying you think you should be president and not him. So why is it so difficult for his rivals to run against him, and run against him on what in any other scenario would be a sort of an easy, low-hanging fruit? Your top rival was just indicted by the federal government. And the sort of imprecise or kind of fuzzy answer I'm kind of getting to as I think about this is Trump is a candidate. He's a rival. He's an opponent for these guys. But Trump is also an issue for Republican voters. Like, Trump himself is an issue in the way that immigration is an issue, in the way that tax policy is an issue, in the way that foreign policy is an issue. But
much more in the way that immigration is an issue.
Yes. But my point
is emotional.
It's emotional. Yes. Yes, that's correct. There is a sort of the question is, are you for it or are you against it? And at the moment, Republicans are pretty united on many things. And the thing that they seem to be most united on is Trump. They're for him. They ain't against him. And if you are making the case against him on matters of, he's got this hanging over him, they're never going to let him win, or he did these bad things, he put national security in danger, he's being indicted, he could be in jail, all of these arguments essentially amount to you're against this issue on which Republican primary voters are pretty united on, that they're for. That is a question that, like, how do you solve that? I don't know the answer. As a reporter and as an editor talking with our reporters at the Dispatch, like, we're all trying to figure out how to get at that story, how to ask these campaigns this question. And the answers so far are kind of, the shrug emoji. It's like, we'll see, that's where things are.
It seems like there's a fairly straightforward calculation that would come into play there, which is that if somebody thought that his shot at the nomination was dependent upon bringing back in to the Republican Party those conservatives and moderates who are estranged from the party because they don't want to be associated with Donald Trump and what Trump stands for, and that style of politics, both in terms of its affect and its content. And I think what they've decided is that they're like, 6 of those guys, and 4 of them work at the Dispatch, and they don't care. A more serious point here is that since 2015, 2016, and certainly since 2016, there's been an assumption at some point that anti-Trump Republicans were going to be a bigger political factor than they have shown themselves to be. In terms of moving the electoral behavior, the vote-seeking behavior of politicians, they seem to be almost completely off the board, non-entity politically. Am I wrong about that?
I think you are.
Okay.
But I don't think you are wrong to sort of identify that they don't appear to be the force that maybe people thought. But I do think they are a force. They just don't appear that way at the moment. To sort of clarify my point. There's a weird thing you're seeing in polling of primary voters, which is that those voters you're talking about, the sort of moderates, anti-Trump conservatives, which there are, many of them are watching right now. Hopefully not all of, hopefully there are even more of them out there, but I don't know. And even sort of independents who want to vote for Republicans, or maybe even put off, I should say, by Joe Biden, who can vote in Republican primaries. Remember, open in Iowa, open in New Hampshire. That those voters make up a significant, part of Ron DeSantis's support. That is where Ron DeSantis is getting a big chunk of that. Whatever you look at it, 15 to 25%, depending on which state, which poll, which is sort of odd if you pay attention to anything about Ron DeSantis's messaging, his campaign. It's all running to the right of Trump. It's sort of trying to almost out-Trump Trump. So I think there's some confusion going on among Republican primary voters, which I don't blame them for, because yes, things are happening. We can see it. We cover it every single day. Things are happening in the campaign, but voters, even Republican primary voters, aren't paying that close attention to it. They aren't clued in, especially in those early states. So in a way, there's the opportunity, I believe, remains. Donald Trump does not have, in the early states where things are competitive, where things are sort of happening, does not have a majority of support of Republican primary voters, which is remarkable. He's running for the 3rd time to be the nominee, and he does not have a majority of support of Republicans. Still has pretty strong support. I'd rather be Donald Trump than any of those others, but that's the opportunity. And you have this weird thing where the candidates who have the opportunity to be the non-Trump candidate, they're sort of all over the place, and they haven't really made the case yet. Ron DeSantis is kind of there as almost as like a stand-in or an avatar for that. They like him because he's not Trump. I have a feeling that space is going to get competitive in a place like Iowa, and certainly in New Hampshire. And Ron DeSantis is going to have to fight for it. And there will be a fight. And maybe whoever has the best response, maybe it's Chris Christie, maybe it's Mike Pence, maybe it's Tim Scott, whoever's maybe the best response to this indictment, and figures out and formulates the right sort of special sauce, the right cosmic gumbo, will be able to pull it off. I think it's too early to discount them, but I think they're confused. Trump voters are not confused. They know exactly what they're for.
I saw Cosmic Gumbo open for the Grateful Dead. A reader, Washer, has a question. Why is Trump having so much trouble getting legal representation? Is it because no one wants the case for reputational reasons, because he's deadbeat, he doesn't pay his bills, or what?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, do you want to represent him, Kevin? Would I want to represent him? No. It's, I think, for a lot of
Wouldn't
those
you,
reasons,
though?
right?
I mean, think of it this way.
Okay. Walk me through it.
Wouldn't you want to maybe, especially if you were not someone who is politically where he is, wouldn't you want to Clarence Darrow, John Adams this and say, hey, I'm a good ACLU member, and I believe that everyone has the right to really capable representation, even this guy whose politics I don't share and who I don't want to see reelected president? Wouldn't that be great for your career as a lawyer, potentially. But also, wouldn't that be not a terrible PR strategy for Trump?
Yeah, I like that idea, actually. I think that
I don't get
could
paid
be.
enough to advise politicians, but
I think that could be what ends up happening. I mean, I don't know. There are people there are reporters I know who know these worlds very well that actually this has inspired me to call them up and kind of ask that question myself, because it's a good question. But I do think he's got problems. First of all, with his tendency to not pay people who work for him. That's difficult. I think there is a legitimate fear that in taking on Trump as a client, you expose yourself to to some legal problems just simply by having him as a client and the things that he asks and expects of you, and
pluck it out.
Pluck it out.
Pluck those
Exactly.
documents out of there.
Exactly. But he didn't say pluck it out.
He did.
It was the motion. It was the motion. That's how you get away with it. You don't say it out loud, you make the motion. And I mean, just the fact that this is a difficult client. This is a client who you can't say, to my point earlier about him being an active candidate for president and a public figure who uses every opportunity to with a microphone to say what he thinks. It's not the kind of criminal defendant you can sort of sequester and say, all right, you're not talking to anybody, you're not doing anything in public. By the way,
have to escrow $1 million just for contempt.
Exactly. So I think it could be the assignment of a lifetime for a lawyer who's so inclined, but it could also be a real nightmare.
Gotcha. We were talking about Christie earlier. You did a long interview with him, right, last week?
Well, it wasn't just me. It was much of the staff of the Dispatch in Washington. He came to our office. To our humble.
Because I missed out on not going to the office, but
exactly. You were missed, Kevin. But there were a lot of people because
I know Chris Christie was looking around the room saying, "Man, I really wish Williamson were here." That would be great. Yeah,
exactly. So no, it was terrific. We'd love to have other Republican candidate. We'd love to have President Biden come by and do a similar conversation. It was pretty freewheeling. We talked to him about a number of issues. This was all before, by the way, really hours before Trump even announced that he was indicted. Yeah. But so we had planned to actually have our interview and some of the quotes come out the next day. Obviously, we've had to delay it, but we put it up on the in a special edition of Dispatch Politics out today. And I learned a lot about kind of not just what we already knew about Chris Christie's approach, going after Trump directly. But look, this is a former two-term governor, a former U.S. attorney, smart guy. Remember, he was pretty policy focused too, especially in that first term. All of the
and currently polling at 1%.
Yes, but look, it's early, Kevin, and we got to hear a lot of interesting things. Yeah, I would say of all the presidential candidates I've heard, maybe only DeSantis rivals him in terms of the amount of policy he's thought about. Foreign policy we talked a lot about. So definitely check out what we wrote up in the Dispatch Politics newsletter about that interview.
I tend to think of Christie as having an advantage in having been governor of New Jersey. Well, I mean, funny thing to say, right?
No, I agree.
If you're a Republican governor of Texas or Oklahoma or something like that, you don't get challenged in the same way you're going to if you're a Republican governor of New Jersey or Massachusetts or someplace like that, or even Pennsylvania. So Christie seems to have some depth to him, both politically and policy-wise. And when he talks, and maybe the tone of his coverage reflects this too, he doesn't feel like a one percenter.
Well, he made this very interesting point. Actually, two things that you raised that he actually brought up himself. He did raise this point that, look, it's easy when you're in Florida. It's a red state, sort of a swipe at DeSantis. He's got the whole legislature there in the palm of his hand. He can get past whatever he wants to get past. He goes, you tried doing that in New Jersey, trying to pass some of those things is difficult. He said, we did pass difficult things. It got Democrats on board. It's an interesting selling point. And he made that point himself. The other thing is he made this point about coverage. He said, he sort of made this meta point, and as much as I cringe when candidates sort of talk like consultants, which is happening more and more, ever since I've been covering politics, it happens more and more. But he pointed out that earned media being things like interviews with the Dispatch or on CNN, or local TV in New Hampshire covering him, Christie speaking somewhere, the kind of media you don't have to pay for. He says that's going to be a huge, significant play a significant role, more so in this cycle than in past cycles. And I tend to agree with him. There's going to be a lot of money out there, but it's all about getting attention because Trump takes up a lot of attention. So if you can get attention as a Republican, that's going to be very valuable. And he said, look, I may not be polling number one, but cameras show up, people show up to hear what I have to say. Why do they show up to hear what I have to say? Because they know I'm going to say something interesting. And the interesting thing he's going to say is Donald Trump should not be president. And people are tuning in to hear that. So Christie's one of those that, again, who knows what happens to him? He could go fifth in New Hampshire again, but he could surprise.
Perhaps the most despair-inducing part of our politics right now is what you've just said, which is the idea that Donald Trump should not be president is an interesting thing to say, rather than just the most obvious thing to say. A question from a reader, which I'm going to slightly reframe here.
Sure.
But I think it's interesting. So one of the things about the early Trump movement, and I think a big part of the kind of cultural and emotional energy that Trump brings is in his anti-elitism, right? This denunciation of the insiders and the swamp and all that. And it's time to finally hold these people accountable and to not treat them as a separate class of people who play under a different set of rules from everybody else. And there's, that's, populist stuff, but there's something to it. There's some good small R Republican spirit to that. But of course, now what's happening is that Donald Trump, who is a lifelong member of that elite and a former president of the United States and notionally a billionaire and a celebrity and all the rest of it, may end up being held accountable. May end up actually fulfilling some of that demand that his candidacy and his political success spoke to. And of course, he and everyone who supports him right now are making the opposite of that case, of saying, well, actually, presidents are a special class of people, and we can't indict this guy and we can't try this guy because he's running for office and he has to be treated under a different set of rules, essentially. Do you have a feeling about where we're going to break down politically there? Are we at our heart a country that says no one's above the law and everyone has to be accountable for his actions? Or are we Italy?
Oof. Oh, that's a great
I'm just thinking
thought.
of Silvio Berlusconi. I was writing.
I know. R.I.P. The bunga bunga parties are over. It's a tough question, Kevin. I think you have to.
What's your feeling though when you're out there talking to people? Is there a sense that look, even if you like the guy, even if you share his politics and you're glad that he came into Washington like a sledgehammer, that obviously he broke the rules. He's a rule-breaking guy. No one reads this indictment and goes, well, that doesn't sound like the Donald Trump I know. Everyone reads this and goes, that sounds exactly like the Donald Trump I know. So is there any sense that that he should be part of this call for retribution that he has made so vociferously himself?
I think with the Republican Party faithful, the sort of the base of the party, it just the dynamic you've just described is alien, is foreign. He is fighting for them. He's fighting for you. They're coming after me, Trump says, because they're really coming after you and I'm standing in their way. That's the sort of formulation that he has created. And
political Jesus.
Essentially, yes.
They hate you. Remember, they hated me first.
You exactly. You could chalk it up to just partisanship. Republicans don't want them to go after my guy. We don't want them to go after our guy. We want them to go after their guy, and Democrats vice versa. But there is something that is that forces or gets voters to cleave more tightly to Trump. And I think it is part of it is the sort of the sheer brazenness of it. It's almost unbelievable. And that does a lot. I think you talk to people I know, people I'm related to. It's just, it is inconceivable that any of this stuff is true. And by the way, what about Hillary? And what about Biden? There's a media ecosystem problem here where if you don't want to hear about it, if you don't want, you said anybody who reads the indictment or reads, straight coverage about the indictment has to reach this conclusion. Well, what if you don't read the indictment? What if you don't listen to give credit to Fox News? They're actually putting people on like Bill Barr, who was on Fox News Sunday, people like Jonathan Turley, to say to actually talk about the content of the indictment. But I don't think that's something a lot of Republican primary voters are hearing. I should say Republican base voters are hearing. I think it's still a question. It's still an open question about whether Republican primary voters are going to be willing to be faced with the truth. And it's going to be up to leaders like the other people running for president to lead them there.
All right. I will have to close it out there. We have gone 1 minute over. So
oh no.
Thank you, Price. Thank you. Ghost of Silvio Berlusconi. Sorry about the jokes, but I think you'll either have no problems or have much worse problems right now, one or the other. Dispatch community members, thank you all so much for being here and for your support and your interest in our work and your willingness to pay for journalism. That's something we all very much appreciate, and we will talk to you next week. Good night.